Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's lecture with Lord Andrew Roberts. I'm glad to see all of you here. Thanks for coming out. Looking forward to this evening with you. My name's Ryan Streeter. I'm the Executive Director of the Civitas Institute here at UT Austin, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you here for tonight's lecture. The Civitas Institute is a community of scholars here at UT committed to exploring the ideas and institutions that sustain a free society and enable individuals to flourish. And if you're not on our list and you'd like to be invited to future events or receive our publications, you can find us at civitas.utexas.edu. We are housed within the new School of Civic Leadership here at the University of Texas at Austin, which is offering its minor in PPE, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics this year, and is going to be welcoming its freshman class next year for its first civics honors degree. So if you know or have aspiring civic leaders in your family, in your friend network, send them our way and encourage them to apply. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event as well. The Athenaeum at the UT School of Law is one of our co-sponsors. The Clements Center for National Security is another. The History Department in the College of Liberal Arts is our third co-sponsor, and then the LBJ School of Public Affairs is also co-sponsoring this evening. So please join me in thanking all of our co-sponsors. And now I'd like to welcome up to the podium my Civitas Institute fellow colleague, David Leal, who is also a professor here in the government department at UT and has really spearheaded tonight's event with Lord Roberts. David, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join this conversation with Lord Andrew Roberts. I'm David Leal, Professor of Government and Director of the British and Transatlantic Studies Program at the School of Civic Leadership at UT. We're fortunate to have Lord Roberts visit us at a crucial time for British and American relations. Winston Churchill coined the phrase the special relationship in 1946 in a speech in Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. He crystallized what many people on both sides of the Atlantic knew to be true, but didn't previously have the words to express. The phrase references not only our alliance in 2 world wars, but also the confluence of political, economic, and cultural values that have been reshaping the globe for well over a century. America and Britain were together creating a world where freedom, prosperity, and the rule of law were becoming an attainable expectation for the present, not just a dreamy ideal for the future. It's a complicated story, of course, but if we look at the state of the globe today, we see a lot of good news, contrary to, I think, a lot of conventional wisdom. Over the last century, everything from income to literacy to life expectancy has increased, and dramatically so. So how did this happen? Well, spoiler alert, it wasn't communism, it wasn't fascism, and it wasn't any kind of authoritarianism. It was the classical liberalism spread by the US and the UK and embraced by so much of the world. Nevertheless, we find that many of these values are under threat today. History was supposed to have ended in the 1990s with the end of the Cold War. Some of you can remember that. But history didn't get the memo. We live in a world that feels increasingly dangerous, perhaps to our surprise. So we need an historian like Andrew Roberts to bring the past alive and show us how previous generations rose to meet similar challenges. This is particularly urgent today because too many Americans have little to no knowledge of Winston Churchill or the special relationship. They have not learned about him in school or in college, or at least not learned anything positive. He's disappearing from the curriculum as out of scholarly fashion or even politically incorrect. And the unsurprising result is that falsehoods about his life and times are flourishing and across the political spectrum. The march of time means that few people on this planet can personally remember Churchill as a real living person. He'll eventually exist only in books, YouTube videos, and episodes of The Crown. Perhaps it's inevitable that over time, teachers of history and politics must add more recent events and therefore cut what they can say about the past. But can we afford to lose Churchill? When I was in the 7th grade, I was assigned a reader in my English class that included an essay by Churchill. I know now it is a section of his book, My Early Life. I wonder how many or how few students today are reading Churchill's own words. It may even be illegal in some states, but not in Texas, not at UT, and not at the Civitas Institute and the School of Civic Leadership. Lord Andrew Roberts is a prominent scholar, public intellectual, and political commentator. He was described by Henry Kissinger as a great historian who was always relevant to contemporary thinking and contemporary problems, and by the historian Sir Noel Malcolm as one of the greatest biographers in the English language today. He has authored or edited more than 20 books, including Churchill, Walking with Destiny, most recently with David Petraeus, Conflict, A Military History of the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III, and Napoleon, A Life. He is currently the Bonnie and Tom McCloskey Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, Visiting Professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, and Lehrman Institute Distinguished Fellow at the New York Historical Society. He received a first-class honors degree in modern history and a PhD from Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge University. He was elevated to the House of Lords as Baron Roberts of Belgravia in 2022, and most importantly, in 2018, he was made an honorary citizen of Texas by the legislature and the governor. So now, Lord Andrew Roberts.
My fellow Texans, I've always wanted to say that. Thank you very much indeed, David, for those kind words, and also for mentioning my peerage. I was appointed by Boris Johnson and confirmed by the late Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. But when Boris fell, I had to be reappointed by Liz Truss. And then when the Queen died, I had to be reconfirmed by King Charles III. I like to say that not since the Wars of the Roses has it taken 4 heads of state and heads of government to make a peer. As David pointed out, it was in his famous Iron Curtain speech delivered at Fulton, Missouri on the 5th of March 1946 that Winston Churchill coined the phrase special relationship. There are some myths concerning it that need to be cleared up before we can come to consider what exactly he meant by it. The first is that Churchill was referring exclusively to a relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Yet what Churchill actually said was, quote, would a special relationship between the United States and the British Commonwealth be inconsistent with our overriding loyalties to the World Organization? The World Organization at that stage was one of the names given to what later became the United Nations. Churchill answered his rhetorical question by stating, on the contrary, it is probably the only means by which that organization will achieve its full stature and strength. There are already special United States relations with Canada, and there are special relations between the United States and the South American republics. We British have our 20-year Treaty of Collaboration and Mutual Assistance with Soviet Russia. The British have had an alliance with Portugal unbroken since 1384. None of these clash with the general interest of a world agreement or a world organization. On the contrary, they help it. Far from being a statement about some kind of unique relationship between the US and the UK, therefore, Churchill's initial statement, at least in the Iron Curtain speech where the phrase first appears, placed it firmly in the context of several other alliances, even one with Joseph Stalin's USSR. It's interesting that in the 5 million words of his collected speeches, the phrase special relationship only appears one other time, when, 8 months after Fulton, he argued in a debate in the House of Commons that, quote, we should not abandon our special relationship with the United States and Canada about the atomic bomb, and we should aid the United States to guard this weapon as a sacred trust for the maintenance of peace. So there, too, the reference was not to an exclusive Anglo-American relationship. It was not in the Iron Curtain speech that Churchill put forward the idea of an overarching Anglo-American alliance, but instead in a speech he had delivered 2.5 years earlier at Harvard University on the 6th of September 1943, also while accepting an honorary degree. He'd travelled to Washington a week earlier to discuss with President Roosevelt the secret negotiations then taking place between the Allies and Marshal Badoglio's government concerning the projected Italian surrender. Churchill later wrote of his Harvard speech, quote, it was to be an occasion for a public declaration to the world of Anglo-American unity and amity. Although he didn't employ the specific phrase special relationship, the Harvard speech went much further in advancing the concept than the speech at Fulton where it did appear. Quote, "Throughout all this ordeal and struggle which is characteristic of our age," Churchill told a packed meeting in the Sanders Theatre at Quincy Street in Harvard, "you will find in the British Commonwealth and Empire good comrades to whom you are united by other ties besides those of state policy and public need. To a large extent, they are the ties of blood and history. Naturally, I, a child of both worlds, am conscious of these. Law, literature, language, these are considerable factors. Common conceptions of what is right and decent, a marked regard for fair play, especially to the weak and poor, a stern sentiment of impartial justice, and above all, the love of personal freedom." Churchill pointed out that speaking the same language meant that it has enabled us to wage war together with an intimacy and harmony never before achieved among allies. This was true. The relations between the British Chiefs of Staff and the US Joint Chiefs of Staff undoubtedly became strained at times, especially over the issue of the timing of Operation Overlord, but overall, they were remarkable for the way in which the bonds never broke. As Churchill once joked to Field Marshal Allenbrook, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. The close cooperation of the combined Chiefs of Staff stemmed more from their common interests in destroying fascism across the globe than their use of a common language, of course, but it certainly helped enormously. Churchill quoted with approbation Otto von Bismarck's comment about the coming 20th century that a dominating fact in the modern world was that the people of Britain and of the United States spoke the same language. And what a language is, ladies and gentlemen, featuring 500,000 words, which is thrice that of German and 4 times that of French. The phrase freedom of speech appears in print in English a full century before its French counterpart. And the quality of that speech is concomitantly profounder for its being capable of being expressed in so wide and varied a way. Churchill, who was to go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, understood all this well. Churchill was on much less sure ground when he went on to state that the gift of a common tongue may well someday become the foundation of a common citizenship. I like to think of British and Americans moving about freely over each other's wide estates with hardly a sense of being foreigners to one another. Having had an American mother and a British father, Churchill undoubtedly saw himself as personifying this concept of a common citizenship, but it never got off the ground as a serious political proposal. If Churchill had been hoping that by floating the idea at Harvard, it might have developed into something more concrete, he was to be disappointed. It wasn't the first time in the Second World War that he had considered the idea of pooling British sovereignty and citizenship. In mid-June 1940, shortly before the fall of France, there was a serious proposal put forward by the British Foreign Office to merge the British and French empires together into a single political entity. The intention, of course, was to try to keep France in the war, as well as to allow the Allies to continue to use the French Navy and overseas territorial provinces against the Nazis after metropolitan France fell. Discussions began between the two governments, and there was even a postage stamp designed. But it all came to a halt when Marshal Pétain's capitulation to the Germans took place a few days later, and is today merely one of those weird what might have beens of history. One person who doesn't seem to have been informed about the idea at all was King George VI, who might have had something to say on the matter. For all that Churchill's kite didn't fly over the idea of a common US-UK citizenship in the Harvard speech, he was on much stronger ground when he came to discussing, though not by name, America First and the isolationist movement headed by Charles Lindbergh that had sought to keep the United States out of World War II before the attack on Pearl Harbor and Adolf Hitler's declaration of war on America 4 days later. Twice in my lifetime, Churchill said, the long arm of destiny has searched across the oceans and involved the entire life and manhood of the United States in a deadly struggle. There was no use in saying, we don't want it, we won't have it. Our forebears left Europe to avoid these quarrels. We founded a new world which has no contact with the old. There's no use in that. The long arm reaches out remorselessly, and everyone's existence, environment, and outlook undergo a swift and irresistible change. The reason that America could not maintain an isolationist foreign policy in the 1940s was very clear to Churchill, who stated, "The price of greatness is responsibility. If the people of the United States had continued in a mediocre station, struggling with the wilderness, absorbed in their own affairs, and a factor of no consequence in the movement of the world, they might have remained forgotten and undisturbed beyond their protecting oceans. But one cannot rise to be the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies and inspired by its causes. If this has been proved in the past as it has been, it will become indisputable in the future. The people of the United States cannot escape world responsibility." Ladies and gentlemen, these words are as true today as they were when Churchill uttered them over 80 years ago. Indeed, it has become even truer in our world of intercontinental ballistic missiles, viruses that skip over oceans, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, terrorism such as that seen on 9/11, air bridges, electromagnetic pulse and cyber warfare, space lasers, ships that can carry 500,000 tons of freight, and intimately interconnected global trade and world markets. Dictators from the axis of ill will, who watch carefully what the West does in one part of the world, such as Afghanistan, before taking aggressive action in another, such as Ukraine, also look closely at what happens there before deciding to do what in a third, such as Taiwan. I see that the Ukraine war, in which there are no British or American boots on the ground, is described only after 2.5 years, 2 years and 7 months, as a forever war. On that basis, World War II would have been described as a forever war at the time of D-Day, which took place 2 years and 7 months after Pearl Harbor. Churchill's Harvard speech was delivered just as global power slipped away from the British Empire, whose colonies became independent in the post-war world, especially in the 1950s and 60s, and moved decisively towards the United States. The baton was passed with remarkably little friction or bitterness, certainly far less than is usually seen in world history when one great power replaces another. Thereafter, Britain became your loyal wingman. She didn't get involved in the Vietnam War, it's true, but otherwise she was always there when you needed her and continues to be to this day. She flattered herself that she hoped to be Greece to America's Rome, but even if that was something of a pipe dream, at key moments in American history, the United States has benefited from having Great Britain stand beside her diplomatically and ultimately militarily. The two countries have had their differences, of course they have. It's clear that the present British government and the Biden administration do not see eye to eye over issues such as permitting the use of Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia and of certain arms sales to Israel being embargoed. Whatever one feels about these individual issues, however, it's clear that the special relationship is unaffected by them. They are arguments between friends, not antagonists, let alone rivals. I slightly suspect that the undisguised hostility presently being seen against Winston Churchill from the alt-right in American politics, witness Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Darryl Cooper that has been downloaded over 33 million times, is not down to the fact that Mr. Cooper genuinely believes, as he claims, that Churchill was a greater villain than Hitler, but because Churchill preached against the kind of know-nothing isolationism that Carlson and Cooper would like to see revived. The obituary of the special relationship has been written so many times over the past 3/4 of a century, yet world events constantly revivify and underline what Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II called the depth and breadth of our partnership. Indeed, I've read the obituaries of many people who've written the obituary of the special relationship. Although history provides many examples of genuine friendship between presidents and premiers, Roosevelt and Churchill, JFK and Harold Macmillan, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, George W. Bush and Tony Blair, and so on, the special relationship has also survived those times when the leaders of the two countries did not get on personally. Lyndon Johnson thought Harold Wilson, quote, a little creep, who was too clever by half. And Edward Heath and Richard Nixon thoroughly despised each other. But the special relationship has survived them, just as it survived President Obama's lukewarm attitude to the nation he threatened to send to the back of the queue over Brexit. One suspects that Donald Trump and Theresa May found little in common, but they both worked to keep the special relationship strong. Yet it would have survived even if they hadn't, because the special relationship is bigger than any individual, however powerful. The military, trade, nuclear, intelligence, financial, commercial, and other links are so wide, extensive, and long-standing, and crucially, so mutually beneficial, that they will survive the passing antagonisms of personalities. Margaret Thatcher put it perfectly when she declared at a banquet in 1985, "It is special, it just is, and that's it." Yet that hasn't prevented the mere phrase special relationship from coming under sustained attack in recent years, and not just from people such as Anglophobes and anti-Americans who would like it not to exist at all. No less a body than the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee has reported that the use of the phrase special relationship in its historical sense to describe the totality of the ever-evolving UK-US relationship is potentially misleading. We recommend that its use should be avoided. President Obama caused some offence in Britain when he said that we don't have a stronger friend and stronger ally than Nicolas Sarkozy and the French people. Because we Britons believe that over the years, and especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we provided the second largest NATO force and concomitantly took the second largest number of casualties, we have indeed been stronger friends and stronger allies to America than France. The British Liberal Democrat Party's election manifesto referred to Britain's supposedly subservient relationship with America, saying that Britain's strategic interests will not be served unless we release ourselves from the spell of default Atlanticism, which has so prevailed since Suez. Boris Johnson's instruction to the Foreign Office to play down the special relationship described the phrase as, quote, needy. In this, he was contradicting the late Queen, who said at the state banquet during the visit of President George W. Bush in 2003, despite occasional criticism of the term, I believe it admirably describes our friendship. Like all special friends, we can talk frankly and can disagree from time to time, even sometimes fall out over a particular issue. But the depth and breadth of our partnership means that disputes can be overcome quickly and forgiven. One such difference came during Barack Obama's presidency in February 2010, when the US State Department called the Falkland Islands by their Argentinian name, Las Malvinas, and announced that the United States was neutral as to their future, which should be decided by the United Nations Decolonization Committee. This implied that the islanders were oppressed victims of British imperialism, rather than people who have regularly voted overwhelmingly, most recently by 98% of the vote on a turnout of 92%, that they wish to stay loyal subjects of the Crown. Yet even Obama, who started his presidency as no lover of Britain, by 2011 was giving a toast to Her Majesty the Queen to the vitality of the special relationship between our peoples. There will be honest disagreements among friends, but then there always have been. Churchill and Roosevelt disagreed on important strategic issues in 1944 and 1945, and as the British historian Richard Aldous' excellent book Reagan and Thatcher, The Difficult Relationship shows, despite their personal admiration, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher often vigorously disagreed over a surprisingly large number of important issues in the 1980s. Yet a disagreement between mutually admiring friends and allies is an entirely different phenomenon than one between people who don't fundamentally get on. In a world where China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others are posing an ever more brazen threat against the rules-based international order, there's nothing needy about Britain staying close to the Anglosphere countries that most closely resemble her in terms of language, law, and shared history, especially the United States. There's a difference between needing something and being needy, and Britain is on the correct side of that divide. With Germany ignoring American warnings over the Russian Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, or President Macron saying that the EU should be, quote, equidistant, unquote, between the USA and China, the Biden administration has recognized, as almost all its predecessors have, that Britain is a far better ally than any of the major available European alternatives. The sheer depth and breadth of our partnership continue to matter. Historically, a strong London-Washington relationship has also been a boon for the rest of the world too. At a time when Iran and its proxies are circling Israel like an anaconda, Putin is announcing the obsolescence of liberal democracy, and National Socialist China gears itself up to try to wrest hegemony from the West. It is unreservedly good news that the special relationship exists. Having faced down the last four great threats to liberty together, from Prussian militarism, Nazi tyranny, Soviet communism, and Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, the special relationship still has much to do for the world. Churchill was on weak ground at Harvard when he spoke of the ties of blood and history, as of course for much of the Anglo-American history before his speech, the relationship was special because it was specially bad, and especially bloody indeed. The burning of the Capitol, the White House and Treasury buildings by Admiral Sir George Cockburn in August 1814 has been a direct consequence of had been a direct consequence of the American burning of York, present-day Toronto, and Newark. Yet after the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, in which a mere 291 Britons died, bloodletting between the English-speaking peoples ended forever. War after 1815 was almost unthinkable, partly because it would have been a conflict between the whale and the wolf. The American wolf would have fallen upon practically defenseless Canada, snatching a vast and vital part of the British Empire. Meanwhile, the British whale, in the shape of the Royal Navy, which was far larger than the US Navy in the 19th century, would have sailed up the eastern Hudson rivers and shelled Manhattan. Mutually assured destruction worked in our ancestors' day just as surely as it does in ours. Yet there were unpleasant moments, especially the Trent affair during your Civil War, diffused in part by Prince Albert just before he expired. For all that Queen Victoria herself might have been pro-American, welcoming the transatlantic telegraph, opposing slavery, writing sorrowfully as a fellow widow to Mary Todd Lincoln, sending books to stock the Chicago Public Library after the 1871 fire, and so on, her ministers watched America with profound suspicion, be it Canadian border disputes, Newfoundland fishery incidents, the kidnap of Confederate diplomats from the British mail packet, the Trent, naval rivalry in the Pacific, or any other number of issues. The only special relationship between London and Washington for most of the 19th century was one of mutual irritation at best. The period that the fear of a whale versus wolf conflict was greatest, however, during the Venezuelan crisis of 1896, went on for over 4 months. And on the 17th of December 1895, President Cleveland told Congress that it was, quote, the duty of the United States to resist by any means in its power the appropriation by Great Britain of any lands which after investigation we have determined of right belong to Venezuela, unquote. The Senate chamber rang with applause, and he won unanimous support for a purely American commission to investigate Venezuela's claims. He had sounded, as Lord Pauncefort, the British ambassador to Washington, reported to the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, the note of war. It was a note supported by over 40 state governors. The German and French press joined the American in paroxysms of excitement about Britain's international isolation and her inevitable humiliation. Canada looked to her military preparedness. The excitable American yellow press, led by William Randolph Hearst, called for war with Britain, as did ex-President Harrison. A war with America, not this year, but in the not-distant future, has become something more of a possibility, Lord Salisbury wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, on the 2nd of January 1896, about Cleveland's electioneering dodge, unquote. As a result of the Venezuelan war scare, but also of British support for America in the Spanish-American War, when most of Europe supported Spain, Teddy Roosevelt's Anglophilia, and the McKinley administration's support for Britain in the Boer War, by contrast with much of the American population. On Monday, the 18th of November 1901, the US Secretary of State, John Hay, and Lord Pauncefort signed the Hay-Pauncefort Treaty, which is a founding document of the special relationship. Covering the Isthmian Canal due to be excavated in Panama, the treaty inaugurated a number of vital Anglo-American agreements over the next decade, covering such issues as the Alaskan and British Columbian border, Newfoundland fisheries, and Jamaica. Although the United States was to keep its secret plans to invade Canada up to date until the 1920s, and Britain resented the growing size of the US Navy in that decade, the outlines for what became a special relationship were firmly in place. Within a few years, once World War II had broken out, the British had very good reason to rejoice that America did have such a large modern navy. Anglo-American relations have thus been on something of a roller coaster since 1776, and President Obama was right when in London in 2011 he describes it as a patchwork heritage. Yet it is one that, since the immediate aftermath of that day of infamy in December 1941, has proved invaluable to both countries and continues to be today. For America to have a trustworthy ally and for Britain to have the ear of the most powerful person in the free world is still important. What could permanently damage the special relationship, however, and to an extent is already damaging it, is Britain's persistent failure to pay enough for her own defence. The British Army's arsenal of 155mm shells, for example, is down to 6 days' supply. We only have 213 Challenger 2 tanks, and a good proportion of them are not ready for active service. We only have 33 F-35 aircraft. The number of soldiers in the British Army is at its lowest level since before the Napoleonic Wars. In 1982, at the time of the Falklands War, the Royal Navy had 43 frigates and 12 destroyers. Today, that is down to 11 frigates and only 6 destroyers. Not enough fully to protect our 2 aircraft carriers. The only reason we can claim to spend a pathetic 2.3% of GDP on defence is that we fiddle the figures by including items such as MI6 and war widows' pensions. The Royal Air Force has lost more than 2/3 of their fighter aircraft in the last 30 years. They had almost 500 in the 1990s and now just 150 in total. They've also lost all of their C-130 transport aircraft, which was scrapped prematurely, despite the fact that they were still usable and had at least 7 years more operational life in them. Britain furthermore wasted a huge amount on the Typhoon Eurofighter, which was a joint venture with the EU, and where each of the 100+ so far taken into service have cost £124 million per aircraft, when we could have bought American F-16s at half the price. Add to that the fact that the Typhoon has had numerous technical problems. Our defence policy, British defence policy, is budget-driven, not threat-driven. And long gone are the days when, as in the Gulf War, we could deploy a division in support of the US-led coalition. Today, we can barely deploy a brigade in Estonia. When senior American generals, including Supreme Allied commanders in Europe, warn successive British governments that they need to rearm in order to stay relevant in international affairs, they are correct, but they are not heeded. The new Labour government states that it wishes to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, which is still ludicrously low considering the growing threats from an ever closer axis of destabilising antagonists, but will not give a formal date for when this will happen. When politicians refuse to give a date for something happening, it's fair to assume that the date might be never. This is the real threat to the special relationship rather than the bleating of British anti-Americans or American isolationists. For the moment, however, despite its enemies, foreign and domestic, the special relationship between your country and mine continues to make the world a much safer, much better, more stable and decent place than it would have been otherwise. Churchill's words at Harvard in September 1943 still resonate today. "Tyranny is our foe," he said, "whatever trappings or disguise it wears, whatever language it speaks. We must forever be on our guard, ever mobilized, ever vigilant, always ready to spring at its throat. In all this, we march together." Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue on that march. Thank you. Thank you. We have plenty of time for questions.
You described previously how the special relationship had overcome a variety of smaller disputes and personal problems, but the special relationship today also faces the challenge of the diverging British and American economies and the increasing cultural diversity of both countries. Why do you think that it will remain intact despite that?
Because I'm not sure that our economies are diverging as much as you say. I think they have much more in common, especially when it comes to ownership. A massive amount of American ownership of British companies and a small amount of ownership of American companies by Britain is still a very important factor in the international economy. And sorry, what was the second part of the question? Oh, yes. I'm not sure that, I mean, we have been extremely diverse with regard to populations since Britain's first set foot in America in the early 17th century. You know, when one thinks of all the various races and ethnic groups that have come to America over the last 2.5 centuries, that hasn't broken the special relationship. In fact, if anything, I think it might have made it stronger. And so I can't see that British ethnic diversity should be a threat to it either. It's one of the strengths of the United Kingdom and America that we get over that kind of thing and put the most important things forward. And the most important things are not race and ethnicity. They're things like world freedom and the threats to it. Gentleman at the back there.
First, I have to tell you, I'm a confirmed Anglophile.
Thank you.
My name is Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T, although I'm now related to the one who got his head cut off. I'm wondering if you have any insight, sir, as to the thinking of Churchill and then Attlee right at the end of the Second World War and thereafter, because we Americans weren't as nice to you British people as we might have been. I'm thinking of Bretton Woods, how we shoved
the nuclear
you aside
issue
from tube alloys with, for the nuclear program, the end of Lend-Lease instantly upon the end of the war in Europe. Do you have any idea what Churchill may have been thinking at that time?
Well, when most of those things happened, he was, of course, out of office. You were right to identify Clement Attlee as the Prime Minister when two, at least, of those three major clashes took place. But it was pretty obvious to Churchill pretty much from the success of Operation Overlord onwards that the United States, having provided the lion's share of the troops and certainly the equipment by the summer of 1944, were going to take the lead in how that war was going to be fought, and therefore in what was going to happen in the world afterwards. It's an interesting statistic, in fact, I think a vital one for the Second World War, when one thinks that in the calendar year 1944, when Britain produced 28,000 warplanes and the Russians and Germans produced 40,000 warplanes each, the United States produced 98,000, almost as much as the whole of the rest of the world put together. And so it was always going to have the strong hand in when it came to deciding what the post-war world was going to be like. The Tube Allies, the collapse of the Tube Allies agreement was a straightforward act by the Senate to establish monopolistic control over that. It didn't work long term because, of course, the British did know how to make the bomb. But overall, yes, it was considered to be a tough time with British austerity and being forced upon us essentially by your unwillingness to continue the Lend-Lease agreements. Although there was a huge loan that J.M. Keynes did agree with the United States, without which I think many economic historians think that Britain could have gone bankrupt in 1945 and 1946. So it's a mixed bag, is the best I can do, I'm afraid, sir. Gentleman at the front here.
First of all, that was a great speech. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thank you.
So my question is, how would we go about building such a special relationship with China?
Well, it takes two to tango, and I don't see any great indication that the Chinese want to tango with you. When one thinks, I mean, they're very proud, and rightly so, of having not, in the last 2,000+ years, projected power beyond their coast. But why, in that case, are they building 13 aircraft carriers? Why are they buying up ports in strategic areas like the Maldives, East Africa, South America? Why is their wolf warrior diplomacy language becoming tougher and tougher? Why, as we saw only yesterday, are they carrying out cyber attacks on our and your commercial enterprises and big businesses? If there isn't a new form of aggression that the why are they saber-rattling as much as they are in the China Sea, of course, against Taiwan, but also the Philippines and other neighbours? It strikes me, you put all of those things together, and what is happening is that they're falling into what an American academic has called the Thucydidean trap, which is the inevitable trap that we see again and again over history of the coming power attempting to dislodge the top dog power. We've seen it since Thucydides, since Athens and Sparta, so many times. And so I think the attempts that America has made to have a good-natured and sort of filial relationship with China, they have been tried, and unfortunately in the last 10 years or so they've been found wanting.
Hi. Is it even possible for America to pursue isolationism even more?
No. It's not for all those reasons that I gave in the speech about the interaction of world trade, the various forms of weaponry, most importantly the intercontinental ballistic missile. Iran would desperately love to have an intercontinental ballistic missile that it can fire at the United States, or at least threaten to fire at the United States. And so you are sucked into all sorts of parts of the world. But as Churchill also said, that is, in a sense, the price of greatness. And if you do want to try to be, even if you did want to try to be a second-rate power that wasn't involved in the rest of the world, you would still have people who hate you enough to unleash chemical and biological weapons against you and so on. You only have to look at what is publicly stated by not least Islamic fundamentalist terrorists to recognize that you absolutely have to be involved in what's going on in the world. And I don't think America would be America if it didn't want to be involved in the forefront and leading the struggle.
So Britain seems to be in really bad shape right now with arresting people for tweets and not arresting any of the Islamic terrorists inside. And it seems like it's going downhill pretty fast. Do you think Britain is going to survive? And if so, how can they with a totalitarian overreach?
Well, first of all, I'd love to take you up on the idea that we don't arrest Islamic terrorists. We most certainly do. We have hundreds of them in prison, and if somebody actually plots or is caught plotting let alone undertaking an act of terrorism, then they are arrested and incarcerated. That's not true. With regard to the tweets, there is a specifically you referring to the riots that took place recently and the people who were arrested for putting out tweets. The people who were arrested and some of them imprisoned were only those who had deliberately led to violence and in some cases attempts to set fire to refugee hostels, which if it had been successful and hadn't been stopped by the police would have led to dozens of people burning to death. We don't go around arresting people solely for making statements. They are warned by the police that they're on the spectrum, as it were. But there's no policy of putting people in prison solely for free speech. It has to be for inciting violence. And some of the violence that they would have got away with if they hadn't been interdicted is truly horrific.
How do you think a potential second Trump presidency would affect the special relationship given Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance's isolationist worldviews?
Well, actually, only today it emerged that President Trump's going to be meeting Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, in Washington. And he said of Starmer that he was extremely popular, which shows that Mr. Trump can't have looked at the polls recently, owing to the fact that he's managed in 70 days to dip below 30% approval rating, which it took Tony Blair 1,070 days to do. But I don't think it will affect us negatively. I think that he'd already been president, of course, for the last 4 years, and the special relationship, as I mentioned, with Theresa May, managed to survive that. In fact, in some areas, such as the possibility of a trade deal, it might actually be better. Of course, we're not going to see eye to eye if President Trump does end support for Ukraine. But that, again, isn't going to end the special relationship.
I have a question about Churchill himself. During the darkest days of World War II, when it looked like Britain was going to stand alone against the Nazis, Churchill was the one who marshaled the British spirit and helped give them the strength to stand up against Germany, and that changed the entire course of the war, the entire course of Western civilization. But immediately following the war's end, Churchill was voted out of office by the Britons that he had led through this cataclysmic conflict. And I was wondering, you're someone who knows Churchill's mind probably better than anyone living. How did he take that? Did he feel betrayed? Did he feel that he had not been appreciated by the British people, or did he have a different view?
Well, he saw that as part of the British Constitution, in that he only stood in one constituency, and where he was victorious, where he his vote held up pretty well. But we have a parliamentary system. It wasn't a sort of presidential-style vote between him and Attlee. If it had been, he would have won. He was welcomed by huge crowds in the election. But they were going to cheer him for what he'd done in the war. They weren't going to vote for him because they didn't think the British Conservative Party was going to deliver the kind of New Jerusalem free goodies that the Labour Party were going to. And in that sense, they were right. Of course, it was the Labour Party that introduced the modern welfare state in this kind of way in which we see it today. The way that he thought about it, I don't have to delve mystically into the mind of Churchill, because his wife Clementine said to him, "Well, it might be a blessing in disguise, Winston." And Churchill replied, "Well, from where I'm sitting, it seems remarkably well disguised." Gentleman there in the black t-shirt.
during your talk, you discussed a lot about the ties between the U.S. and the U.K. in terms of political leaders. One thing you didn't discuss nearly as much is the commercial and the economic ties between the two countries. And, in thinking about this subject, I'm kind of dwelling on how a lot of the really prominent names in American business in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries are notorious Anglophiles. So could you just comment and elaborate on that aspect of the relationship a little bit more, and specifically within the realm of banking?
Yes. He, of course, personified exactly that, Anglo-American unity, in that his mother, Jenny Jerome, was born in Brooklyn, the daughter of a American financier, Leonard Jerome. His cousin, the Duke of Marlborough, was married to the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt, Consuelo, and that marriage essentially saved Blenheim Palace from collapse, because the expense of keeping it up was picked up by the railway magnate Vanderbilt. And you see also with a large number of British families who, because of the collapse in agricultural prices in the late 19th century, did turn to America, specifically in the marriage market, to sort of save their stately homes. On occasion, this worked extremely well, and the people fell in love with one another after they got married. But in a large number of cases, they didn't. You wanted to know about banking in particular, a classic example being J.P. Morgan himself. Well, he was a great Anglophile. He came over a good deal. He invested in British companies, of course, but also he bought British art, and he was to be seen in the auction houses at Christie's and Sotheby's, buying up other beautiful parts of the British heritage. And we were thrilled that he did, because, as I say, the people who were selling it very much needed the money. It was a two-way street. It wasn't as though the Americans were getting ripped off the entire time. Consuelo Vanderbilt did become a duchess of the great, and lived in the greatest palace that we have in the United Kingdom. One that George III, when he left Blenheim, said, "We have nothing to equal this." He meant that the royal family had no palace that was as grand as Blenheim, and it's true. So please don't think of it solely as a one-way street. Yes.
You've talked about how the special relationship has survived lots of spats and slights and less polite political moments, and how you believe that the economies are strong enough to survive for much longer. What do you think would result in this relationship not surviving?
Well, I think one of them is that if we can no longer physically be your loyal wingman in future engagements, we were able to provide an entire armoured division at the time of the Gulf War. We could no longer do that, couldn't begin to do that. And so, although you might continue to like us very much, and I hope you do, if we can't actually be of any real use in terms of hard power and realpolitik, then that is obviously going to damage and possibly one day end the special relationship. Gentleman next to you.
Hi there. Thank you for talking, first off. And then my question is more of the individual countryman kind of like persona of both American and British folk. I think that Churchill was very proud to be British, and he definitely saw some type of good in the British citizen as well as the American citizen. And now in this kind of like postmodern era of quite a bit of distraught between citizens, and like Americans overall, I don't believe are very kind of vigorously like proud to be American at this point. And I don't know if that's the same for Britain, but I was just wondering, like, can't you not really have good friends unless you are proud to be yourself? And my question is, can America and Britain truly have a great bond if there is some kind of lack of unity and identity within themselves?
That's a very good question. And actually, there has been a survey by a big survey, multi-thousands of people asked by, I think it's called British National Surveys. And sure enough, you're absolutely right. In the last 10 years, pride in being British has dropped from 86% to 66%. And this is largely because, I think, of the culture wars, of being told constantly that because of the empire and slavery and so on, Britain was a terrible place. We recognise that, of course, for an awful lot of people, for an awful lot of time, it was indeed a terrible place. But there are the other positive aspects. A classic example with regard to slavery is that we abolished it 57 years before you did and didn't have to kill 700,000 people in a civil war to do it. There is an underlying sort of anti-Britishness that is taught in our schools, and that's after 14 years of Conservative government, 14 years of Conservative education secretaries, and yet you're still at this rather dire position where the automatic assumption is that anything Britain did in the past was evil and wrong. I don't know. Maybe I'm being naive. You must tell me. But it doesn't. I'm not sure I believe you when you say that most Americans are not patriotic. I see, especially here in Texas, actually, as we said, rather a overt love of your country. It's something that I enjoy to see.
Thank you for coming out and speaking to us tonight. My question is, I read an article once about the way the British government will influence and interfere with American elections and politics. And I was curious if you see this actually happening and if you think this is good or bad to the special relationship.
We go out of our way not to at all. I mean, it's British politicians. Certainly, the last thing they want to do is to get involved in American elections for the obvious reason that if they choose the wrong side, then you're out of influence for years. There has been some people in the Labour Party have come over to give advice on elections to Kamala Harris's campaign, but these aren't official people. They're individuals who are doing this. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are people from the Conservative Party who are doing the same thing for Mr. Trump. But what you certainly don't get is anything near what Russia is trying to do, for example, in affecting your elections, because we're both democratic countries and Russia isn't.
How can the American conception of free speech and the First Amendment be reconciled with British culture and policies of censorship, perhaps even through diplomatic pressure?
We don't have censorship, is the first thing. What we have are libel laws. So if you libel somebody, if you say something about somebody something that is clearly completely untrue, you do have recourse in law, and you can't hide behind an amendment to the Constitution owing to the fact we don't have a written constitution. You can argue, and lawyers do, till the cows come home about which is the better system. I feel good about the idea that if somebody says something that's completely untrue about me, I can fight back in the courts. But equally, of course, it is beautiful, the wording of that Second Amendment of yours, and one of the finest things that your founding fathers, who should not be denounced and denigrated and their statues torn down and treated in the way that they have been, in my view, owing to the fact that the incredible courage that they showed in standing up against the most powerful empire in the world and building a country which and producing a document that 250 years later still keeps this vociferous continent together as a single nation is something that should be admired. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.